My initial noticings of this book by Jenny Heijun Wills were first admiration for her bravery in the raw nature in which she describes her life story growing up as a Korean adoptee in a Canadian family that lived in a predominantly white town. She speaks about how she always felt disconnected with her Korean culture and grew up in an environment where she felt programmed to learn English and French and was forced to assimilate to Canadian culture. The themes in the book cover her feeling a lack of belonging, the confusion, loss, grief, abuse, and abandonment issues that caused lasting trauma that followed her all the way into her adult life, feeling like the adoption agencies profited off of other people's misery, and the painful process of reconciliation she went through as she tried to reconnect with her Korean family and make sense of her traumatic upbringing to give herself an opportunity to break generational curses. So she felt disconnection from her Korean culture and feeling a lack of belonging. As discussed in the intro, Wills felt like she was placed into a culture that forced her to assimilate and left her feeling a lack of belonging. Whether it was never seeing any Koreans or representation of her culture in grade school, which led her to hating herself, or when she went to college and all the Koreans laughed at her for being whitewashed, she describes living most of her life feeling as though she had no culture and didn't belong anywhere. Students would make fun of her and assume she was from other Asian backgrounds as they hurled racial slurs and insults at her, and she felt like her teachers were never there to defend her. The way that she described her experiences reminded me of the Ladson Billings article that talks about the importance of teaching with a culturally sustaining pedagogy, which is described as the ability to link principles of learning with deep understanding of and appreciation for culture. Wills says that her schools taught using post-racial notions that we are all the same. This often translates into teachers continuing to teach with a colonial framework and mindset and doesn't take into account the diversity of our learners. Wills encapsulates this idea perfectly when she says in her book, "Being visible isn't the same as being seen." Discriminatory treatment at this young age can enact lasting damage on development, which is shown in Wills' memoir. She also talks about multiple levels of abuse that she experienced, sexual and psychological. In her memoir, she describes her journey of flying to Korea to reconnect with her family. When she arrived, she's put into a guest house for other Korean adoptees from all around the world, and she describes the energy there as a place of palpable confusion, loss, and grief. This was a house where collateral damage collided, and many of them dealt with substance abuse, abandonment issues, food insecurity, and felt as though they were members of a lost generation. She describes her own experience with sexual abuse, using alcohol to soothe her wounds like all the others in the guest house, and communicating with the other adoptees through shared trauma and pain, also known as trauma bonding, and experiencing racism in her homeland because she didn't know how to speak Korean and didn't look like everyone else. Her descriptive way of making you feel like you were there experiencing her trauma was very powerful, and the multiple traumatic experiences she faced as a child and as an adult can serve as a reminder that we never really know what our students have dealt with or are currently dealing with. Tatum's article gave me more insight into our role as educators and adults, which is the responsibility to try to identify and interrupt this cycle of oppression. When we recognize that we've been misinformed, we have a responsibility to seek out more accurate information and to adjust our behavior accordingly. This leads me into my last section, which is about the implications of Wills' memoir on the future of education and how we teach our students with fewer deficit-based attitudes and respect their diversity, especially in a city like Toronto that is so multicultural. So for the future of education, Wills' memoir highlights the complex and layered nature that many people embody and live within. As kids, we don't get to choose our parents, where we live, whether we're born as a man or a woman, our socio-economic status, the trauma we're subjected to, and many other factors in our upbringing. And this is something that we as educators need to understand and be sensitive about when instructing the learners that we work with. Tatum's article suggests that understanding and unlearning prejudice and racism is a lifelong process, and I couldn't agree more. Especially with the world changing so much, this is something we're going to have to continue to educate ourselves on every day, every month, every year. Living in a country like Canada with such a deeply rooted colonial past, it could take generations to undo the damage that's been done and continues to be done on our students. And that's why it's important that we teach using a culturally sustaining pedagogy and a justice-oriented approach that can change ways of thinking that injure and exploit other people and places during the process of decolonization that we find ourselves in today. Many of our students come from families that are experiencing intergenerational trauma, And with many teachers spending more time with their students than the students spend with their own families, it's important that we continue to educate ourselves so we can play a positive role in helping our learners to heal and overcome their traumas, rather than re-traumatizing them and contributing to further damage.
Master, moving stones around is one thing. This is totally different.
No different. Only different in your mind. You must unlearn what you have learned.
All right, I'll give it a try.
No, try not. Do or do not. There is no try.